Hey guys, Nicole here with Obscure Reptiles and Caging, and today we're going to be talking about what ball pythons to avoid. So let's get started. Alright guys, so today we are actually going to be talking about ball pythons that you want to avoid. We're going to break this down into two different categories if you are looking for a pet ball python or if you are specifically a breeder ball python. There are different things to look for depending on what you are. Alright, so let's say you are someone looking for a pet ball python. The first thing you want to consider is, are you looking for a young snake or an older snake? Always remember that there are pros and cons to either of these things. You might want to avoid a baby snake if you don't want one that's very snippy. Babies can be incredibly snippy. If you want something that you're going to grow up and be with for 40 years, then a baby would be a good option. As snakes grow, they change. Sometimes they want frozen, sometimes they only want live. They require bigger enclosures, smaller enclosures. So if you want the simplest animal, I would say get a 5-year-old male ball python. They're not going to need any size larger than the one cage that you're going to have to get them. They generally go off feed in winter, or they at least slow down in winter because of the breeding season, so you don't even have to feed them every single week. They tend to not want to eat a lot of the times when it's the coldest, and they stay relatively small. If you want the full experience and you want to grow up with that animal, then a baby would be a great option. Things you're going to want to completely avoid are any animals that seem sick, or depending on what pet store you're going to. It's always better to go to a reptile breeder like Twisted Reptiles. There are tons of different breeders out there. You can even go to reptile shows. But if you are going to a reptile show, talk to the person breeding them. If they have no answers about this snake, either it might not even be one of their snakes, it might be wild caught, ask them questions. Go on their different social media and see the different reviews that were left behind. But make sure you are doing some research. You want to make sure whatever animal you're getting, this could be a 40-year commitment, you're actually happy with the animal, and it's something that you really want. Now on the breeding side, some things you are definitely going to want to avoid when it comes to breeding are different genetics have different issues. We'll call them malfunctions. Different snake morphs do not go together as well. So we're going to cover a little bit about that. We'll go back to the pet side here in a little bit, guys, but we're going to talk now a little bit about people specifically for breeding. So one thing you want to stay away from if you are new to breeding are snakes that have issues with their genetics. So for example, a super black pastel or a super cinnamon, which are normally all black snakes, which will look absolutely beautiful, are very susceptible to a few different things. One is called duck billing. Their nose is super wide and they have a deformity with their jaw. Sometimes it's called a shark jaw, where their jaw is too far back. The top of their nose and mouth is way too big. I'll see if I can find photos online, but that's the number one with those morphs. Number two with those morphs is they can have kinks. Kinks are when the spine is deformed, and depending on how bad the kink is, that baby might not survive, especially if it's above the tail, so it could actually be causing a blockage when they're going to the bathroom. Normally below the tail is not as detrimental, but it all depends on the actual snake. There are a few other things, but those are the most common when it comes to those super cinnamon, super black pastel ball pythons. There are other snakes that have those issues as well, but those super dark snakes, for whatever reason, those are normally tied to those animals. So you're going to be super cautious if that's something you're trying to breed, or if you are breeding any of these snakes we're about to talk about, throw a ton more genes in there. When you have an animal that has a lot of genetics, then it tends to wash out some of these defects. So here's a boy that we produced. He could be a super black pastel or a super cinnamon, but based on his pairing, he has a lot more genes to wash him out, so he's perfectly healthy and doesn't have any of those issues. So he is actually from a spider, cinnamon, calico, enchi, to a mahogany, mojave, cinnamon, black pastel, also enchi? I'm not sure. He's 5 gene, but it's a 5 gene to a 4 gene female. And the male, this baby, we have no idea what his genetics are, but the fact that he's super black, plus he has no kinking and no duck billing, no issues, he must have more genetics in him to make him a healthier version. It's kind of like when you overbreed, let's say, one line of dogs and they start looking a little weird, but you put another line into them and they start getting healthier. It's basically the same thing. Another thing, for example, is a spider gene. Spiders and hidden gene woma and a couple other genetics like that as well have what's called stargazing or wobbles. It's a neurological issue. So instead of just being able to sit or strike, they kind of go like this all the time. They wobble all over the place. They look up at the sky and they do some weird stuff. Sometimes they can't even strike at a rat. They have such bad wobbles. They kind of do these crazy things, and it's very hard and difficult for them to eat. It's not necessarily a death sentence, but it is something that can be very, very extreme or very minimal depending on the spider or hinging woma that you have. But if you put more genetics in there, then you limit the effect that that wobble can have on the snake. So for example, that 4-gene female I said I have, she has no wobble. She has no issues whatsoever with anything that she's ever done, because she is basically, the spider's kind of washed out by those other genetics. And the only reason why I chose that 5-gene male to put with her is by putting a 4-gene and a 5-gene together, there was almost no chance of getting a normal spider. It was something like a 8%, 2% chance to actually get just a normal spider, which is what we don't want. We want multiple gene spiders if we produce any spiders at all. Another thing that is not always frowned upon, but I personally do not do it, is sibling snakes. Some people will breed snakes, and the only reason why that can be something that is necessary is if you have, let's say you breed 2 snakes together and the babies come out super strange. Like you think that there is genetically something interesting going on. You think you've created a new morph or something is odd about them. You then breed the son back to the mother, or you breed 2 of the siblings back to each other, and that way you can prove out if it's genetic. So if the baby that was then produced is super, super different, then you could just have proved that it is a recessive gene, co-dom gene, dom gene, whatever it is, just basically by breeding them together, instead of, for example, taking the babies, breeding the male, breeding the female, taking those babies, breeding them somewhere else, and then breeding them back. It's just a lot easier to, for example, take the male that, one of the sons that could be ready in just a couple of months, to then breed back to the mom the next season, and then you can find out genetically what's going on. I personally don't do that. For example, we have several albino pied females we have held back, and we actually went out and got another albino pied male, which now we have 2 of, just so we don't have to breed the daughters back to the dad. Which it can be done, especially in breeding ball pythons. Normally there's not too much of an effect, but it just kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies, so I specifically went out and got another one just to avoid that. Another thing you want to avoid if you are breeding ball pythons is creating simple genes. Unfortunately, normal ball pythons sometimes are 20, 30, 40 bucks at shows. Sometimes people use them for feeders for other larger snakes, things like cobras and stuff that are not legal here in New York. But a lot of times they're kind of what's considered a throwaway snake, a normal ball python, just a simple lesser or a simple spider, pinstripe. You want to make sure you are creating things that not only make you happy, but are going to be different and stand out and are not overproduced. Right now there are a ton of normal banana males on the market. The last like 2-3 years there are a ton of normal male bananas, which are so they're basically selling for no money at all, which not only is bad for the breeder, but a lot of times if people don't spend very much on their snake, unfortunately they're not going to put enough time and effort and care into that animal. It's not always the case, but from a breeding standpoint, I never want to produce normals. There are already enough normals out there as it is. I'd rather produce something cool that not only is going to be financially beneficial, but it's going to be something that if someone's going to pay for, someone who's going to pay for, let's say, a $200-300 snake generally is going to take a little bit care of it better than someone who's buying a $20 snake. Again, that's not everybody. I'm not trying to stereotype, but if somebody is going to get a very, very cheap animal, they kind of consider it more of a throwaway animal rather than something that is a 40-year commitment. Alright, back to the people who are looking for a pet ball python. Something you really want to avoid is if you go, let's say, to a pet store and you ask them questions and they know no information on the snake. It's just a ball python that's been sitting there. I won't mention any big brand names, but if they have absolutely no information and they don't even know the morph, it's just called a fancy ball python, it's a big red flag. I would highly recommend going to a breeder. Normally you're going to get better morphs for better pricing, and people actually know about the animal. They have answers to your questions. We've raised these animals. We're going to be able to tell you what they're eating, how often, what the parents look like, all that type of stuff. You're not going to get that from a pet store. So make sure that not only are you going to a breeder, but you're going to a reputable breeder that knows what they're talking about and has a good background in ball pythons. There are newer breeders out there who are doing things correctly. It doesn't mean a new breeder is a bad breeder, but just make sure you guys are doing your research. You want to avoid people who have a lot of negative reviews. There's no way to make everyone happy, especially when it comes to reviews, stuff like that. There's always going to be some angry people for some odd reason. So even reviews, take those a little bit with a grain of salt. But if they've got 200 good reviews and 5 bad reviews, I don't think that that's a red flag whatsoever. When it comes to getting a pet, just make sure you get something that you think is cool. It doesn't really matter if you're not going to breed them, you just want a pet. Just get something that you think looks interesting. You could get a spider with a wobble. You could get something that has a little bit of a deformity or a slight kink or anything like that. Some ball pythons are a little bit different than others. It doesn't make them a bad pet. If it is something that you want to breed in the future, do not get something that is deformed or, for example, is missing an eye or has a deformed jaw, has a kink. You do not want to breed something like that, but there's nothing wrong with getting something like that if you want specifically a pet. Alright guys, that's it for this video. If you have any questions, you can put them in the comments below. If you haven't already, please subscribe. We do new videos every single week, and I'll see you guys in the next video.